acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay tribute to their history, their culture and their ongoing contribution to our communities. The 14th of September 2012 will become a shameful day in Australia's history. Today, up to 50 people from Sri Lanka, Tamils, have been sent to Nauru. You've heard what appalling conditions they will live under. They don't know when they will be able to get away from that island, when they will have their rights recognised, when they will be able to try and deal with some of the terrible trauma that they have obviously been through. We stand here today with the hundreds of thousands of Australians who are deeply distressed by what this government is doing. And we certainly need to, and I would encourage all of you to, when you're having your conversations, to encourage people to speak out on this issue. Because we do have to face, we're in tough times with regard to refugee policy. In the Senate, I saw Labor and the Coalition sit together to pass legislation after legislation. And I just want to say a little bit about how Labor handled that. They actually not acknowledge that when you're a member of a party, often you have to vote with that party and you may not agree with it. But what we know with Labor is that it is quite possible for Labor MPs to speak against what they disagree with, and then they may be bound, and then they are bound by caucus to vote for it. What's been absolutely shameful with the legislation that went through this week on Nauru and the legislation that's gone through over the past month is that you weren't hearing those speeches from the Doug Camerons of the world, from the other members of the left, about how wrong this policy is. And the hypocrisy here is deeply shocking. Because, and this is actually something that just keeps happening just about every day, Barnaby Joyce is revelling in this. What he ridicules Labor about is that Labor have got through a policy that he reckons, and he's probably right on this, that they wouldn't have been able to get through such a tough policy, such an extremely shameful, cruel policy, and that Labor have been able to get through because obviously the Coalition were ready to vote with them. This week, Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who is the spokesperson for the Greens, put a question to the Minister in the Senate who is responsible for these issues, Kate Lundy. And it was about how they're going to get people off the plane if they refuse. We couldn't get them down to the detail, but what they admitted, that they will use necessary and reasonable force to get the refugees off the planes and onto Nauru. Now, the Prime Minister of Nauru said he doesn't want any force to be used, but already you've got the government saying that's how they're going to handle this situation. I mean, at every level, the government cannot be trusted. When you start working with a coalition on refugees, they have sold out. And I do want to emphasise all the way through this, the Greens have been putting proposals to Labor, and as you know, we basically have the numbers in the two houses where we could have got something decent, something humane through in terms of reforming refugee policy to meet our international obligations. Now, again, I think it's worth knowing because, again, I want to emphasise we voted against that legislation. But once it was in place, we looked at, well, how do we do something to ensure it's not so bad? One idea we came up with, let's put a time limit on how long people can be kept on Nauru. We put up that they could be left there for a maximum of 1 year. Again, that was voted down. Like, how inhumane. We also put up, and this was on after lobbying by a number of health organisations of Labor and the coalition parties, and the Greens put up that there should be an independent health panel to monitor the welfare and the health of the people in detention centres, and that was voted down. And we know from the past experience over the past decade the enormous mental health problems that are just facing the people who have to live in these detention centres, live with not knowing when their case is going to be processed, when Australia will actually follow our international obligations. So at every turn, it is very deeply troubling. I think we also need to pay some attention to the company that is going to run this detention centre, Transfield. Now, those of you who follow New South Wales politics, and I'm pleased Paul McAleer is still here, Transfield who have just got the contract for the Manly Ferries, Paul? Yeah. So Transfield is a company that's done very well out of successive New South Wales governments. They've also won the contract to do the transport, the security, run the facilities on Nauru. This company has zero experience doing that. It's interesting to look at the financial health of this company. The shareholders wouldn't be real happy. It's been largely flatlining. And however, Serco, that runs the existing detention centres, what have they had? They've had a 45% increase in their profits. Profits last year at about $49 million. And here we have Transfield putting their hand up and successfully winning that contract. Where this becomes even more interesting is that Transfield has been a very generous donor to both Labor and the coalition parties. Shame. They've given, over the past decade, they've given more than $1 million to Labor and the coalition. Labor receiving much more than the coalition parties. Interestingly, one of the Transfield companies, and there's a whole group of them, and it is Transfield Services that won the contract, have adopted a policy that they will not give any more donations. So there you have, they're saying, sounds really good, good PR, we're not going to give political donations, we'll just engage with being a good corporate citizen. We've already found out, we run the Greens run a project called Democracy for Sale. We've ascertained that they've already broken their own policy because they gave a donation to the Liberal Party about 8 months after they adopted their own policy. Transfield also try and make out, that they do their job properly. So we've just been looking at what they're up to. They run buses. They're the main bus operator in South Australia, in Adelaide. And they've been fined by the South Australian government, criticised by both Labor and the opposition, because their buses don't run on time. So, okay, just about running on time, but my point is, this is a company that doesn't do its own corporate job as it makes out that it does. It's got a donation history that I think should be embarrassing and quite shameful in terms of how the corporate world works, and now it goes and puts its hand up and wins a contract to run this detention centre. I mean, what experience do they have? Now, people say to me, well, they're not actually the ones who have to deal with the refugees. If you're serving meals to the refugees, if you're driving them around wherever you have to on Nauru, you are clearly coming into contact with people. And I'm sure you've heard the horrendous stories from how the detention centres on Australian mainland are run. So all this reminds us just what a sellout it has been in this legislation being adopted. I congratulate you being here today and again emphasise that message that I started with. We all need to go forward into our own communities when we're having a meal, when we're standing in a queue at the shops, when we're sitting on the bus, start up a conversation about this. Because shamefully, sadly, a lot of Australians don't realise what our own government is doing to people who have every right to come to this country. It's a right that we need to ensure is recognised. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee.